6 weeks after Damon Voss put a ring on Maren Ellis's hand, he took it back. Not out of cruelty. Not out of doubt. He slid it off her finger at 11 at night, in the dark of his own study, and closed his fist around it so tight his knuckles turned white, because the woman standing in his lobby downstairs, the one his head of security had just called about in a voice none of them had heard him use before, was supposed to have been dead for 26 years. Her name was Elena Voss, and she was his mother. Maren found him like that ring gone from her hand, his back to her, staring at a phone screen that had gone dark 5 minutes ago. She had never seen Damon Voss look small. Not once, not even bleeding on a sidewalk with a bullet wound in his arm. Tonight, in the low light of his study, he looked like a man standing at the edge of something he had spent half his life running from. Damon. She said his name carefully, the way you'd approach a door you weren't sure was locked. What happened? He didn't turn around right away. When he finally did, the ring was still in his hand, and his eyes held something she had never once seen there in 6 weeks of loving him. Not fear of a rival. Not fury at a threat. This was older, deeper, the kind of fear that only comes from childhood. There's a woman downstairs, he said. Security flagged her at the gate an hour ago. She gave a name that hasn't existed in any file I own for 26 years. Whose name? He looked down at the ring in his palm before he answered, and when he did, his voice had gone flat in a way that frightened her more than shouting ever could. My mother's. Maren felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. In 6 weeks of learning every guarded corner of this man, he had told her almost nothing about his mother, only that she had died when he was young, delivered once, flatly, the way a person recites a fact they've long since stopped feeling. She had assumed the silence was grief. She was beginning to understand it might have been something closer to a locked door he'd never let himself approach. Damon, she said carefully, your mother's been gone since you were 8. You told me that yourself. I know what I told you. He finally set the ring down on the desk, his hand lingering over it like he wasn't ready to let it go completely. It's what I was told, too. For 26 years. It's the only version of the story I've ever had. Downstairs, security cameras were already streaming footage to the monitor bank in the corner of his study. Grainy, black and white, a woman standing perfectly still in his marble lobby, hands folded, waiting with the patience of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment for longer than Maren could imagine. Records said Elena Voss died in a house fire on October 9, 1998, in a small town outside Albany. Damon was 8 years old. He remembered the smoke. He remembered his father's face at the funeral, dry-eyed and unreadable, and he remembered learning, before he was old enough to understand what the word meant, that grief in his family was something you buried alongside the person and never spoke of again. For 26 years, that was the whole story. A dead mother. A closed casket he was never allowed to see inside. A father who built an empire out of the ashes of that house and taught his son that weakness, including the weakness of mourning, was the one thing that got you killed in this business. Now a woman with silver hair and Elena Voss's exact eyes was sitting in his lobby, asking to see him. Maren watched him pace his study like a man circling a wound he didn't know how to touch. You don't have to see her tonight, she said quietly. I know, but you're going to. Damon stopped pacing. He looked at her the way he had that first night on the pavement, like she was the only steady thing in a collapsing building. 26 years, Maren. I built a shield around the part of me that lost her. If I open that door, I don't know what walks back out. Then don't go alone. She reached for his hand, the one still curled tight around her ring. You've spent 6 weeks making sure I never faced anything by myself. Let me return the favor. Something in his jaw loosened, just slightly, the way ice cracks before it finally breaks. He nodded once. Elena Voss was 71 years old, thinner than she should have been, with a stillness in her posture that spoke of a woman who had spent decades training herself not to draw attention. When Damon walked into the lobby, she rose from the chair like the floor might disappear beneath her. Damon. Her voice cracked around the single syllable. You look exactly like him. God help you, you look exactly like your father. You're supposed to be dead, Damon said. Not cruel. Just factual, the way a man states the collapse of everything he'd been told was true. I know. Elena's hands trembled at her sides. I have 30 years of reasons why, and I understand if none of them are enough. But I don't have 30 years left to explain them, Damon. I have months, maybe less, and I couldn't leave this world without you knowing the truth first. Damon thought the hardest conversation of his life had already happened 6 weeks ago, on a stretch of pavement with bullets in the air. He had no idea the real reckoning was still waiting for him. Sitting in his own lobby, wearing his dead mother's face. They spoke for 3 hours that night, in a private room upstairs, Maren seated quietly at Damon's side the entire time. Not speaking, simply present, her hand resting over his on the table the way his had once rested over hers in a moment that had changed both their lives. Elena's story came out slowly, in pieces, the way truths do when they've been buried under decades of silence. She hadn't died in that fire. She had run from it. Run from Damon's father, a man whose violence toward her had escalated for years behind the closed doors of a house that looked, from the outside, like any other family's home. She had staged her own death with the help of a federal witness protection contact, believing, wrongly, catastrophically, that leaving her son behind was the only way to guarantee he'd survive a war she could never have protected him from herself. Your father would have used you against me, Elena said, tears finally breaking free down lines in her face that told the story of every year she'd spent alone. The moment he knew I was alive, he would have hunted us both. I told myself I was protecting you. I have spent 26 years wondering if I destroyed you instead. Damon sat in silence for a long moment, his jaw working, his hand gripping Maren's beneath the table like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the room. He told me you burned, he finally said. He let me carry that. For 26 years. He wanted you to believe love like that only ends in ashes, Elena whispered. That's how he taught you never to risk it again. Maren felt Damon's hand tighten around hers, and understanding crashed over her with the force of a physical blow. Every wall he had built, every year he had spent believing that attachment was a weakness that got people killed. It hadn't started with the Empire. It had started with an 8-year-old boy standing at a closed casket, being taught that the price of loving someone was watching them disappear. That's why you never let anyone close, she said softly, more to herself than to him. Damon turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, the mask he wore for the rest of the world wasn't there at all. Until you, he said. You were the first thing I ever let myself want, knowing exactly how much it would cost me if I lost it. Elena thought she had finally told her son the whole truth. She had no idea that the same rival family responsible for driving her into hiding 26 years ago had already learned she was alive, and was watching this building right now. The wedding had been scheduled for 6 weeks from that night. A small ceremony, close friends only, exactly the kind of quiet celebration Damon had promised her the morning after the Castellano family disappeared from the city for good. Now he sat across from Maren in his study, the ring back in its box on the table between them, unable to look at her directly. I need to postpone it, he said. Maren's chest tightened, though she kept her voice level. Because of your mother. Because of what my mother brought back with her. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion carved into every line of him. The man she ran from wasn't just my father. He was tied into 3 other families before he died. Families that never closed their books on the Voss name. If word gets out that Elena Voss is alive, every one of them will come looking for leverage. And you, he said, meeting her eyes now, are the single largest piece of leverage I have ever allowed to exist. So the answer is to push me away again, Maren said, quieter than she meant to. Just like 6 weeks ago when you decided distance would keep me safe. Damon flinched like she'd struck him. That's not, isn't it? She stood, arms wrapped around herself. An old defensive posture she thought she'd left behind on a sidewalk 6 weeks ago. You told me distance was the mistake, Damon. You told me the day they took me that you'd never make it again. Now the first time real fear walks back into your life, you're reaching for the same old solution. The silence between them stretched long enough to hurt. I'm not trying to protect you from marrying me, Damon finally said, low and rough. I'm trying to protect you from marrying me before I've made sure you're not walking into a war I haven't finished fighting yet. Then let me fight it with you, Maren said. The way I did the first time. I'm not the same woman who used to disappear into the back office so no one would notice her. Damon, you made sure of that yourself. He crossed the room and pulled her against him, his forehead dropping to rest against hers, the fight draining out of both of them at once. I know, he murmured. I know exactly who you are. That's precisely why I'm terrified of getting this wrong. Maren believed the greatest danger they faced was another family coming for Damon's empire. She had no idea the true threat had already made contact, with someone standing much closer to both of them than either had ever suspected. The call came 4 days later, and it didn't come from a rival family at all. Came from Lorenzo Marsh, Damon's former head of security, the man he had erased from every ledger and every door key after the ambush, the man responsible for selling Maren's location to the Castellanos in the first place, had resurfaced with information no one else could have known. He knew about Elena. He knew she was staying in the city, and he wanted a meeting alone before he decided whether to sell that information to the highest bidder among the families still circling the Voss name. You erased him, Maren said, staring at the burner number Damon's men had traced the call to. How does a man with nothing left to lose still have something to sell? Because I made a mistake, Damon admitted, and the admission cost him visibly, a man unused to naming his own failures out loud. I let him disappear instead of making certain he disappeared completely. I wanted to believe erasing his life was punishment enough. I forgot that desperate men always find one more card to play. Maren watched him work through the numbers in his head. Security routes, contingencies, the particular calculus of a man who had spent his whole life turning threats into solved problems. But this time, something in his approach was different. He wasn't shutting her out of the planning. He was building the plan with her sitting directly across the table, asking her opinion on details he would once have handled alone in total silence. You're doing it again, she said, watching him, bringing me in instead of pushing me back. I told you I learned, Damon said. I don't intend to unlearn it because I'm frightened. The meeting was set for a private dock at the edge of the harbor, neutral ground, midnight, no more than 2 men on either side. Damon insisted Maren stay behind this time, not out of the old instinct to protect her from every risk, but because the plan required someone monitoring the security feeds in real time, someone he trusted absolutely to make the calls he couldn't make himself if things went wrong on the water. It was, Maren realized as she took her position in the surveillance room, the first time he had ever handed her power instead of shielding her from danger entirely. Lorenzo arrived exactly on time, thinner than the photographs in Damon's old files, his eyes darting with the particular paranoia of a man who had spent weeks looking over his shoulder. I don't want money, he said, before Damon could speak. I want out. Permanently. A new name, a new country, enough to disappear so completely that no one, not the Castellanos, not you, ever finds a trace of me again. And in exchange, I tell you exactly who else knows Elena Voss is alive, Lorenzo said. Because it isn't just me, Damon. And it isn't just the families you're already worried about. Damon believed he was negotiating with a desperate man for a single piece of information. He had no idea Lorenzo was about to hand him a name that would change everything he thought he understood about his own father's death. The name Lorenzo gave him that night belonged to a federal agent, a man who had spent 3 decades quietly building a case not against Damon, but against the truth of how Damon's father had actually died. Not heart failure, as the official record claimed. A calculated removal ordered from within his own organization by men who had grown tired of a leader too erratic, too violent, too dangerous even for their world to tolerate. And the man who had made that call, according to records Lorenzo had spent months quietly gathering as his own insurance policy, was someone Damon had trusted his entire adult life. Someone who had stood beside him at every negotiation, every rebuild, every war he had ever fought to protect the empire and the woman he loved. His father's oldest advisor. The man who had personally recommended Lorenzo for the head of security role in the first place. Damon stood on that dock in the dark, the weight of 3 decades of manufactured history collapsing around him at once, and understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water down his spine, that the war he thought he'd already won had never actually ended. It had simply been managed by the very people who started it. He returned to the penthouse at 3 a.m. to find Maren still awake, still at the monitors, refusing to sleep until she knew he'd come home safely. When she saw his face, she didn't ask what happened. She simply crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, anchoring him the way she'd done on a stretch of broken pavement weeks before. It's not over, Damon said into her hair. It was never actually over. I just didn't know where to look. Then we look together, Maren said. Whatever this costs, whoever it turns out to be. The following morning, Damon confronted the man his entire empire had been built on trusting, in the same glass office 40 floors above the city where this story had first begun. There was no gunfire this time. No violence at all, only the devastating, absolute quiet of a man laying out 3 decades of manufactured lies in front of the person who had told them, and watching that person's face confirm every word before he said a single sentence in his own defense. You were a boy, the advisor finally said, when the silence had stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. Your father was going to get us all killed. I did what was necessary to protect this family, the family you built out of what was left. You let me believe I lost my mother to fire, Damon said. His voice a low, lethal calm that filled the room more completely than shouting ever could. You let me become a man who couldn't trust anyone, for 30 years, to protect a decision you made when I was 8 years old. There was no violence in what followed, only an ending swift, total, and absolute, the same way Damon had ended every other threat to what belonged to him. By nightfall, the advisor's name existed nowhere Damon's organization still touched. Elena Voss, for the first time in 26 years, was no longer hiding from anyone. Damon believed uncovering the truth would finally give him peace. He had no idea that the woman standing beside him through all of it was about to ask him a question that would matter far more than any answer he'd just found. They stood together on the balcony that evening, the city spread out below them, indifferent and glittering, exactly as it had been the night he first told her she was the reason he understood what all of it was for. Elena sat inside, finally at rest in a home her son had built without ever knowing she might one day walk back into it. 26 years of lies, Damon said quietly, and I still don't know how to feel anything except relief that it's finally over. You're allowed to feel more than one thing, Maren said, leaning into him. Relief and grief aren't opposites. Sometimes they arrive holding hands. He turned to look at her, and reached into his jacket for the small velvet box he'd been carrying for 4 days, waiting for the right moment that never seemed to arrive amid everything else. He opened it now, the ring catching the last light of the sunset, and held it out to her without a single rehearsed word left in him. I took this back once, he said, because I was afraid of what loving you might cost me. I'm done being afraid of that math. You are not a risk I'm calculating anymore, Maren. You're the only certainty I have left. Maren looked at the ring, then at the man holding it. A man who had spent 30 years building walls to survive a war that had never actually ended, until the day a woman he almost overlooked walked into his office and refused to disappear into the background the way the world had trained her to. Put it back where it belongs, she said, holding out her hand. He did, and this time, neither of them had any intention of ever taking it off again. Some people spend their whole lives building walls to keep the world from getting close enough to hurt them again. It takes a rare kind of courage to finally let someone in, and an even rarer kind to stay once you see everything they've been hiding. Damon Voss learned that love isn't the weakness his father taught him to fear. It's the one thing strong enough to survive even the truth. If this story found something in you, if you've ever loved someone enough to face the parts of yourself you'd rather keep hidden, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of your stories are the reason I keep telling these. And if you're not ready to leave Damon and Maren's world just yet, stay close. Their story isn't quite finished, and neither is the next one waiting for you right after this.